So I've been informed by Canada's legacy media that on the topic of the carbon tax, either you can believe big, scary, and probably evil Conservative Party leader Pierre Poilievre, or you can believe 200 wise experts who probably donate a lot to charity and they're attractive people to boot. Or at the very least, this is how Bruce Arthur is trying to frame the issue over at the Toronto Star. But let me be clear, I've seen this being done by a lot of legacy media journalists and opinion writers in the past. But Bruce Arthur put out this article, and it's titled, Pierre Poilievre Says One Thing, 200 Experts Refute It, Who to Believe. And that's particularly sad to base an entire article on an appeal to authority fallacy. But I wanted to make this video because of this one line that Bruce Arthur put up in the article, and it says, well, what about more than 200 Canadian economists? Because that's how many signed a letter this week addressing the main arguments against carbon pricing. And he goes on to basically detail out what their opposition was to Pierre Poilievre's opposition to the carbon tax. But let me just cut to the chase and say this is all completely silly. I want to jump over to that letter right now because, at least in my opinion, it's full of it, and it proves it's full of it in one of the first lines. So it kind of details out the purpose of this letter, but on the first little debunking that they do, the critics claim number one, they immediately say something that's entirely false in the first in the first line. It says, since federal carbon pricing took effect in 2019, Canada's greenhouse gas emissions have fallen by almost 8%. Okay, this is entirely untrue. It's true in the most technical sense that GHG emissions have fallen, but if you're somebody with a real head on their shoulders, you wouldn't take this at face value. Oh, our GHG emissions have fallen since 2019? Well, does that have anything to do with carbon tax? Well, no, but this letter of economists who should know better are okay with saying that, well, the carbon tax works because GHG emissions have fallen 8%. Well, how did they fall 8%? I just want to quickly bring that up on screen, and you should realize how dumb this is immediately. So this is Canada's GHG emissions in tons over time. And so in 2019, the carbon tax comes into effect. We're at 578 tons per capita or whatever it is. I don't know. Sorry, I didn't look at it that deeply, but it's 578.6. And then we have fallen to 8% as of the year 2022 or 2023. Well, maybe that has to do with the fact that between 2019 and 23, we had a COVID-19 pandemic where people were locked up at home, and it ended up severely slowing down the economy and ruining many businesses. The fact that you'd have economists sign on to this partisan hackery claiming, well, the carbon tax works, line one of their debunking, they put this as their number one point. This was their strongest point because you always put your strongest arguments first. Everybody knows that. And their first argument against the critics like Pierre Poilievre, Danielle Smith, Scott Moe, Blaine Higgs, all the other premiers against the carbon tax, their first line trying to debunk their claims is itself wrong. That yes, emissions have fallen by 8% because the economy cratered during COVID. Well, yes, we can reduce emissions if we lock up people at home, crush a bunch of small businesses, slow down the oil and gas industry, and do a bunch of other terrible things to Canada's economy. Then we can actually get emissions lower. And it keeps going down these different kind of debunking points. All of them are either trying to make a point based off of pure technicality, or it's stuff that's just not true. At one point, they just shift over to doing flat out Liberal Party propaganda, saying, well, you know, people actually do make more money on the rebate than they pay in the carbon tax, just pushing out a PMO talking point from Justin Trudeau himself. It's not correct. They should know better. They don't really care to know better because you have to realize this, and it doesn't shock you probably, that universities are full of leftists. They're full of people who, sight unseen, agree with the concept of a carbon tax, whether it works or not. I just finished my master's degree in public policy not that long ago, and what I wrote on was effectively a long debunking of the idea that poverty drives crime in Canada, that if poverty rates go up, that means crime rates will go up. And it sounds on its surface like that must be true. Well, you know, of course, people are poor, they're going to commit crimes. It's not actually true. There's tons of low-income communities all over Canada that have super low crime. It is communities that are impoverished and also have weak education sort of systems as well as bad family structures. That's where you find crime. crime ends up being a completely incidental factor. You can find communities where there's high crime, where there's not that much poverty, and you can find areas with tons of poverty, but there's no crime. But you'll have all these people coming out and still just saying, well, you know that 375 people, and the funny thing is these are educated people coming out. They're like, well, 375 people now disagree with Pierre Poilievre on the carbon tax. Who cares? I know economists who also don't like the carbon tax. Are their opinions now devalued? Well, I guess they are, because Brian Berget came out, and he's a conservative candidate actually in British Columbia and a university professor. And he was mocking Bruce Arthur for updating his article saying, okay, it's closer to 340 economists now. And Brian Berget responded to this by saying, how many voters were like, nah, I'll vote Poilievre if it's only 200 economists. But if it were now at 340, forget it. I'm Team Trudeau again. And this is how the legacy media thinks that you should think. That if they have, frankly, enough of their friends from academia come out and say, actually, you're wrong to not like the carbon tax, that you're going to sit back and say, well, I guess I like the carbon tax now. A hacky professor from a random university told me the carbon tax is good. Well, I guess it is good. And the funny thing is, when I scrolled through the list of professors who are signed on to that letter, a lot of them, like a lot of the ones who are missing, are very telling. I know some professors who lean a little bit left who are not on that letter. I guarantee they approach them because they're very famous people who tend to discuss sort of fiscal policy and whatnot in Canada a lot, and they're not on this letter. And I can guarantee you that they didn't sign on because they thought this letter was full of crap, and it's basically just liberal propaganda that a bunch of left-wing professors are willing to sign their name next to because they don't like Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives. And it's so obnoxious when you see all these academics coming out and saying to people, and I'm not trying to do this whole pulling this whole lived experience thing, though if someone has a lived experience, you can't disagree with them. But I'm talking about like the lived experience of millions of people in this country. A lot of people are economically struggling, and whenever the carbon tax goes up, they can feel that pain in the bills that they are having to pay. Yes, these people can say, well, it's only 3 cents a liter it's going up by. It's only 3 cents a liter. Okay, guys. Yeah, I know that all these professors who make $300,000, $250,000 a year can handle the price of 3 cents a liter, especially a bunch of them live on campus, depending on where they're teaching at. But guys, like, people actually have to deal with physical, real life reality. And that when the carbon tax is hurting them and they've turned against the carbon tax, there's probably a reason for that. And you coming out with a fallacious argument that, well, GHG emissions are actually down, so you should be okay with taking a bunch of economic pain. No. I'm against all net zero policies for this very reason. I don't care how much we can reduce emissions if we just hurt a bunch of middle class and low income Canadians by jacking up taxes on energy that people need to survive. I'm not for that because that's ridiculous and actually a very nasty thing to do to people. The idea that it's okay to impoverish some people because, look, we reduced emissions by 8%. We really didn't do that because of the carbon tax, but, that's just details. Where I never want to push any economic policy that for an abstract goal that doesn't actually make anyone's life better, we're going to hurt people. No, I'm not going to sign on to that. And the media is effectively trying to gaslight people into reading enough times across the headlines that, the experts are saying that you're making money on the carbon tax. You should like it. People live with it. They know they're not better off. It doesn't matter how many times you tell people they're better off. They're not better off, and they're not going to believe you. It is the most belittling kind of way of talking to Canadians possible. The idea that, well, you're just not smart enough to understand the complex brilliance of the carbon tax. It's not brilliant, guys, and it's deeply unpopular. So maybe the Liberals should try and figure out a way of actually climbing down from this terrible policy rather than having hacky morons like Bruce Arthur write up articles about how you should believe in like Liberal Party policy because appeal to authority. I don't care. Anyways, that's it for me today, guys. I just wanted to quickly do my normal shameless plug that I, Wyatt Claypool, am running for the Conservative Party nomination in Calgary Signal Hill. If you live on the west side of Calgary, check if you live in this riding. This is what the new riding boundaries are going to look like. buy a membership, vote for me, check out my website, wyattclaypool.com. And if you want to support myself and the National Telegraph's legal fund, I also have that link down in the description below. We are dealing with a really stupid lawsuit right now that's being dragged out for 2 years because the guy suing us has no point and no evidence. So if you want to help us reduce the burden of our legal costs, the Give, Send, Go link is in the description below. Contributing anything to us really helps lower the burden of our costs. I've paid more than $26,000 defending myself and the National Telegraph. So if you guys can contribute like 50, 60 or so, it does help make sure that I can actually make payments for other things than just legal fees. Okay, well, that should be it for me today, guys. Have a good one.